Hi everyone, this is the slideshow for the other two types of arguments that you can make in your rebuttals, arguing about the relevance of their information and the sufficiency of their information. One of the things that you'll notice in the guidelines for the grades for debates is in the rebuttal I'm looking for one of the things is sort of a comparative wrap-up or like a final argument, and so this is one of the ways you can do rebuttals, but also you can do that kind of comparative wrap-up by saying, we have more credible evidence, or we have more evidence that is sufficient evidence, or that their evidence isn't relevant to the points that we're trying to debate today. So to start with relevance, relevance is the question of how well the information contained within a source or within the debate fits the question or argument for which you are considering. So in other words, does this information really refute or really support the point that they're trying to make? Or is it not really relevant to the points of contention? Remember, there are a lot of arguments we could make that don't address the points of contention themselves, right? So for instance, questions about where Black Lives Matter gets its funding doesn't address whether or not we should defund the police. Questions about, other Americans or other countries being racist doesn't address whether or not U.S. Policing is racist. So, does this evidence or does this argument really address the points of contention? Is the issue of relevance. Some questions you can kind of ask yourself to think about, whether the evidence is relevant or not. First, what aspects of this source's argument are tangential or unrelated? For instance, I've seen a lot of arguments out there about how the courts and sentencing and juries are biased against people of color. But our point of contention here is about the police, and the courts and juries are not relevant to that point of contention. Another question, how much is the probability of the original statement affected if the argument in question were true? That is, if I grant this argument, does that really mean that my argument is not true? For instance, if we were to say Black Lives Matter is a communist organization, that doesn't really, we can grant that and say, yeah, fine, that's true, or maybe it isn't, but fine, that's true. But doesn't challenge whether or not there's abuse and racial profiling and implicit bias amongst the police. In other words, if the premise were true, does it make you more likely to believe that the conclusion is true? If yes, then the premise is relevant. If no, then the premise is probably not relevant. Or another question you can ask, even if the premise were true, should it be a consideration for the accepting the truth of the conclusion? If the answer is no, then the premise is probably not relevant. So a couple of examples here. Jerry is over 6 feet tall, so he must be good at basketball. So our premise is he must be good at basketball, right? Our conclusion. And how tall you are doesn't really determine whether you're good at basketball or not. So the answer is no, that premise does not, is not true. Avatar is an artistic masterpiece. After all, it was the highest grossing film of the year. Just because a film made a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that it's an artistic masterpiece, right? So again, the premise doesn't really back up the claim here. There are some common fallacies of relevance that you'll see oftentimes in our social media and maybe even encounter them in our debates. And I'm going to cover them a little bit here. One is called a false equivalency. It's the idea that just because two things share a single trait doesn't mean that they are the same thing. So just because, for instance, some protesters engaged in violence or burned a building doesn't mean that all protesters are violent, right? That's sort of a false equivalency. What's called post hoc ergo propter hoc is the idea that just because something comes first doesn't mean that's what caused that to happen. So, for instance, just because we increased police funding and crime went down doesn't necessarily mean that it was police funding that reduced crime. That could be a lot of other factors, right? It could be that the economy was doing well. It could be that people were becoming more educated. Um, so just because one thing happens before another doesn't prove that it caused the other thing to happen. This is called a tu quoque, or also sometimes whataboutism. So this is what happens when you make a criticism and that you answer that criticism by criticizing something else, right? The police are abusive. Well, sometimes protesters are violent, right? Uh, or we might say, um, someone committed a sexual assault. Well, so did someone else, right? What about so and so, right? That's why it's sometimes called whataboutism. And obviously, someone else's flaws or another institution's flaws does not answer the fact that the original person or institution had flaws. Another is called an appeal to tradition. Just because that's the way we did it doesn't mean it's right to do it that way always, right? So we say, oh, but we've always really funded the police, or we've always had the police, we've always had a war on drugs. Just because that's a tradition doesn't mean that's a good thing, right? Obviously, this kind of appeal would justify something like slavery, right? Well, we've always had slavery, we've always had segregation, and obviously, just because we've had it before doesn't make that relevant to whether or not it's a good argument. What's called a straw person argument is when a person answers an argument that the other side was not making. They they create a straw person, a straw man version of their argument and attack it. So I see this a lot in our debates and our briefs and stuff, where people equate defunding the police with abolishing the police, right? Abolishing the police is crazy. Yeah, but no one's really arguing abolishing the police. That's just a straw person argument that they're making. Non sequitur is just linking two points that have nothing to do with each other. So it's another good way of saying this is not relevant. Is that's a non sequitur. That's not relevant for the moment. And another really common one is what's called the bandwagon or the ad populum fallacy. That's the idea that just because a bunch of people think it's a good idea doesn't necessarily make it a good idea, right? Maybe your parents told you once, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too, right? Just because everyone likes it or everyone's doing it doesn't make it a good thing, right? Just because 70% of people are against defunding the police doesn't mean that it's not a good policy. That's not a relevant argument to the claim here. And then finally, we have a false dichotomy, where you say there's only two options, and that's not necessarily the case. So if someone were to say defunding the police means that you're disrespecting the police, right? You either fund them or you disrespect them. Those are our two options that are given. That's obviously not the only two possible options. You can decrease police funding out of respect for the police, thinking, the police are asked to do too many tasks and we should have them focus on what they do well, which is fight crime, instead of responding to, like mental illness calls and stuff like that. So it's not relevant. It's a fallacy of relevance because, those aren't the only two relevant options. Next, we can talk about sufficiency. In order to accept an argument, there needs to be a sufficient amount of data to accept its conclusions. That is, things like one anecdote or one example or even one study, that studies like one city or only a few hundred people might not be sufficient evidence to prove the argument. And in your rebuttals, one of the things you can say is, for instance, we've offered multiple studies and they haven't provided sufficient evidence to refute those studies, or that this is only one study and it goes against many other studies. So it's not sufficient evidence. The questions to ask yourself: are the reasons provided enough to drive the arguer's conclusion? In other words, are there enough reasons? Is there enough data here? Is the premise based on insufficient evidence or faulty causal analysis? Some premises or data provide evidence that is based on too small a sample or unrepresentative data. Again, a study that only studies 30 people or only one city might not be relevant or might not be sufficient. It might be unrepresentative. If you study inner city Chicago only, that might not be representative of all cities or all areas of all cities. Also, maybe the personal experience of the arguer might not be sufficient, or your acquaintances' experiences might not be sufficient. So if you were to say, all of my black friends say the police mistreat them, yeah, that might be some evidence towards your claim, but it's not sufficient evidence. And then finally, is there some key or crucial evidence that's missing that must be provided in order to accept the argument? That is, oftentimes people will make a claim but not have much data to back up that claim, right? We say, for instance, here's some evidence of cops doing positive things. Isn't sufficient evidence to back up the idea that cops are good people. Some common fallacies of sufficiency. One's called cherry picking, which is where you omit relevant data. You pick only the data that really supports your argument. So we only focus on one city or one example of defunding the police and that working. For instance, there's a bunch of stuff out there about Camden, New Jersey defunding the police. But Camden's a pretty small city. So maybe, that's sort of cherry picking in the sense of, you're picking one city and using that, one small city and using that as an example. Or another example is I've seen some studies about police killings that omit killings that were found to be justified, that the police review board said were justified killings. And this is sort of cherry picking, right? Part of the affirmative argument is that the police as an institution exhibits racism. So maybe they're calling certain killings justified that aren't really justified. I think of like the Tamir Rice killing or the John Crawford killing, right? So they're omitting the quote-unquote justified killings from their data in order to say, see, look, there's no disproportionate killing. But when in fact, they're cherry-picking that data. A slippery slope is an argument that says if we take this one step in a direction, then that will devolve into sort of the worst case scenario, right? So if we were to defund the police, then no one would respect the police anymore, and criminals would see it as a license to do whatever they want, as a sort of a slippery slope argument, right? Another slippery slope argument might be like, if you don't convict this one cop, then police will feel justified in abusing people of color whenever, they want to. Obviously, there's not sufficient evidence to prove that each of those steps would take place, that all respect would go away, or that all cops would start abusing people of color. What's called a hasty generalization is typically when you take an example or an anecdote and make a generalization based on that example or anecdote. So if you were to say, the George Floyd killing proves that police use force way too often, right? Obviously that was a dramatic example, but it's only one example, and it's not enough to prove the more general claim that you're trying to make. The final one, this has to do with studies, and this is the idea of a skewed sample, or also maybe an insufficient sample size, where you attempt to use, one study that only studied a small portion of people or focused on, particularly egregious cases or something like that in order to prove a more general claim. Again, typically the way academic studies and scientific studies work is people tend to, try to redo the study and verify them more than once. So that way, when there's only one study that supports it, but all the other ones say no, then we might have sort of a skewed sample or an insufficient sample to prove the point. Um, and that's why, using more than one study and backing it up with more than one piece of data can be the best way to provide sufficient evidence. Now these are, I think sort of common sense in a way, relevance and sufficiency. But you'd be surprised how often, you know, teams and arguers out there make irrelevant arguments or offer insufficient data to back up their points. And I think as a rebuttalist, you can really stress some of those points. If you can prove that you have more evidence and more sufficient evidence in your rebuttal, you can even point out, look, we have 5 studies that say the police use force against people of color more often, and they only have 1 study that says the opposite, which means we have more sufficient evidence, right? Or relevance, we have 5 studies that show, you know, police abuse people of color, and their study only talks about justified killings when we're talking about all killings. So our evidence is more relevant to the issue at hand. Can be ways in those final rebuttals that you can really make strong arguments for your team. Of course, you can just refute the arguments directly as well. They say, yes, X is true. We say, no, that's not true. But these are ways to challenge their data, the relevance of their data, the credibility of their data, the sufficiency of their data. And if you can point out that one of those things is lacking in your rebuttal, then you'll go a long way to wrapping up and winning the debate. I'm really looking forward to these debates, and I will see everyone on Thursday for our coaching sessions. Have a good week.